Your deck do.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
I need more stuff. Can't see, I need more stuff. And now it goes. I'm keeping up with the Joneses.
Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Dude, what do people's decks even do? What do they do?
Brando being skeptical about what your deck does.
Brando is just not interested if your deck doesn't have a clear, articulated idea of what it does.
He's not buying it, man.
If Brando's not buying it, I'm not playing it.
Yep. Yeah, so this episode's going to be about, kind of get, what's the through line for your deck? What is, when you're brewing, what does your deck actually do? I think, Phil, pre-show, you said it best. Everyone knows what a combo deck's doing, right? Everyone, for the most part, knows what a Delver deck is doing. But what, these mid-range pile decks, it kind of gets a little foggy about what's going on there.
Zach, you play A-Cast. What does A-Cast, what does your deck do?
I make a bunch of artifacts that make a bunch of giant robots, and I attack with those giant robots, hopefully stopping you from doing your plan along the way.
Yeah, this is more of an esoteric episode, I think. I've been seeing a lot of new action with Lord of the Rings cards. Excellent. Yeah. There's a lot of brewing happening. We were talking last week with Sam the Stouthearted and Sorens Ransom. I'm seeing that pick up a lot in decks outside of just Shadow. I'm seeing Sam show up in like these bouncy mid-range Esper sort of piles, something that we talked about last week, showing up in D&T, Sorens Ransom showing up in those sorts of fair decks with like Snapcaster Mage, because the ring can tempt the Snapcaster Mage, and then you can pick up with Caracas and then replay the Sorens Ransom. It's kind of a revamping of Kolagan's Command Snapcaster. It's like a fun little place to be. And I'm seeing all these decks, and I think they're super sweet. But then I also see a lot of lists where it's just a mishmash of good cards, and it makes me think, what does your deck even do? Is it just cast good cards and hope that they're good? That's reasonable. If that's the plan, I'm just playing a bunch of good cards, and I'm just going to cast good cards, and I'm going to hope that the good cards are good, and that they're going to do good stuff for me, and then I'm going to have a good record after I play in the good event with my good cards. Like, if that's the way you want to be, totally fine. Totally get it. But if you're trying to like streamline or optimize or a list or build off of a brew that you're experimenting with, or trying to figure out what are the cards that you can't cut, or what are the areas that your deck is going to be soft, and you're analyzing all that and you're play testing, I think it's important, or maybe not important, but it's valuable to be able to know what your deck does. Yeah. What does your deck do? Like, give me the log line. What's your deck do? I play A-Cast. I want to jam a Chalice on turn 1 and hope it gives me a free win, and if it doesn't, I'm going to cast a whole bunch of artifacts to make giant constructs with the Urza Saga and beat you down. Like, okay, sweet. That seems like a sweet plan that you can do in the dark against every single deck, regardless of what they may or may not be on, and then adjust accordingly after the fact. But if you sit down in the blind against an opponent and you don't know what your deck does, how are you supposed to play it? How are you supposed to play it if you don't know what your deck does?
Yeah.
I'm trying to do what my deck does. Combo is really easy because combos are just established of like the entire deck built around the combo. I'm playing Storm. My goal is to amass enough raw resources that I can Storm count to 10 and kill you with Tendrils of Agony. Okay, well then that means that most of my plan should be about trying to accumulate enough resources fast enough, which means that I'm going to do all the things that we know that Storm does. It's not really reinventing the wheel in that sense, but like at least you know what the deck is trying to do every game. You sit down and you're trying to do it. I play Cephalid Breakfast. I need to find a Cephalid Illusionist, pair it with Nomad's Encore or Shuko. I'm going to mill my library, and I'm going to rebuy Thassa's Oracle. But I know that first, my goal every game is to get a Cephalid Illusionist and pair it with a combo piece. Okay, there's your game plan. Show and tell. I want to cast show and tell like a big oaf and put a big oaf into play, and then hopefully the big oaf wins me the oaf game. Like, sweet. So let's talk about the decks that is not as straightforward of what your deck does.
I think we've seen some of those decks start to pop up with the Lord of the Rings cards starting to be tested a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that a list that was sent to me that sort of paralleled what we talked about last week of the ring temps you starting to see play a little bit more between Sam the Stout-Hearted and Sorens Ransom, and maybe putting them in the same deck, and then that puts you in Esper colors, which gives you Caracas, which helps you pick up the legendary creature that you make off of the ring. That sort of little shell is nice, but there isn't necessarily something going on that you can log line with that shell, right? I'm playing Ring Tempts You cards to maximize the value of Caracas.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. But like, how? What is it that you want to do? Do you just want to pick up something with Caracas? It doesn't seem like that's the way that you optimize winning the game. So I would think.
Well, what do you want to pick up with Caracas, right? That's the next question. Like, you know, be specific. Like, you know,
if somebody, it helps articulate this sort of log line to know, okay, if I'm cantripping in a certain way, my plan is I would like to pick up my Snapcaster to rebuy my Sorens Ransom, to re-legendary my Snapcaster, to do it again with the next Sorens Ransom.
Yeah.
I want to bury you under so much card advantage between the combination of Sorens Ransom and Snapcaster Mage that you cannot recover. I just grind you into the, like, I have so many resources that the rest of the game doesn't matter. Okay, I like this plan, but now we can lean towards, okay, I need to pair Snapcaster with a Sorens Ransom to get this sort of engine going, and then fill out the rest of the deck to support that shell resolving.
Yeah,
I think that's
it's wild that we didn't look at Sorens Ransom initially and go, this is built for Snapcaster Mage. Like, you're gonna make it legendary, and then you're gonna recast Snapcaster Mage. It's putting cards in the graveyard. You know, like that card is so much deeper, I think, than we really gave it credit for. And we gave it a lot of credit, honestly.
We gave it a lot, yeah. I think it's also because that is also, it's a slow combination.
Yeah, like, it's 5 mana, right?
Casting a 3 mana, well, you would first want to put a Snapcaster into play, so you're spending, seemingly 3 mana to do something. That way your Snapcaster is not just a 2/1 flash. And then after that, you're then going to play a 3 mana spell to play your Snapcaster, but then you're going to have to pick up the Snapcaster by finding the Caracas. How many Caracas are you playing? So it's a lot of hoops to jump through to not actually do anything other than go up raw cards. But then the question is, okay, well, what are those raw cards?
What are those cards? Yeah, what are those cards?
And I think that's where I was sort of on this idea of, like, what does your deck do? Because it's like, if you want to grind the opponent down, well, what does that mean? Not every card is going to trade, like, not every card grinds the same way. You know what I mean? Like, Thoughtseize grinds differently than Swords to Plowshares. A counterspell grinds differently than a removal spell. So, like, how are we actually pairing this together in a way that it is going to be the thing that you want to do every game? And part of your log line can make assumptions, right? Like, I play a lot of Miracles, right? Every time I sit down at the table playing Miracles, I'm making the choice assuming that my white cards have text. If Terminus does not have text, I'm in for a rough game 1, right? It is an assumption I'm making about a meta that I'm walking into, that my cards will have text. Now, if I was going in blind and I want to be able to have the log line of, I'm going to rebuy my Snapcaster and get a bunch of Snapcaster value, then that would imply that there's a lot of action going on in my graveyard. So can I do something else? Instead of moving in and playing Esper, am I splashing a Caracas and I'm moving into an Uro package because I can mill the Uro and then further grind that way? It is all to say that if I'm going to log this deck, this Esper deck, or this blue-black splash deck, I'm trying to Snapcaster Sorens Ransom to load my graveyard to escape Uro without having to play it on the front half first. That's a different plan, and also an interesting plan than I want to play Sam the Stout-Hearted alongside Wasteland and the Ring Tempts You and load up the ring all the way to the max and chunk you with these dorky beaters while I sort of play this a little bit bigger than Delver tempo plan.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm saying it's good for you to know going in how to navigate your deck so you know how to utilize your tools. If you're saying to yourself, I want to be a Ring Tempts You mid-range mana denial deck by rebuying my Wastelands with Sam the Stout-Hearted, and then that might move you away from Snapcaster. It might move you towards playing something like if you're in Ring Tempts You and you want to play mana denial, you're like, I don't know, fucking Avalanche Riders, man. I'm gonna fucking Avalanche Riders you and Ring Tempts You and pick it back up and then I don't fucking know. You know what I'm saying? But like it at least gives you more of a dedicated plan as opposed to having like these alternating paths where you then pair different parts of your deck with different things, with the other parts that work with the other half. You know what I'm saying? It's cantrips usually are used to like solve these problems, but let's say you have you're playing Sam the Stout-Hearted and Wasteland, right? Those things work together, right? I want to waste you, and then I want to Sam the Stout-Hearted and pick up my Wasteland and Wasteland you again. But if I'm going, okay, I want a Sorens Ransom with Snapcaster, well, Snapcaster and Wasteland isn't necessarily conducive to the same plan as what Sam and Wasteland is, which is Wasteland is trying to deny resources, and Sorens Ransom Snapcaster is trying to like go up resources. Like by that I mean like you playing a Snapcaster or Sorens Ransom isn't necessarily denying your opponent resources unless you're pairing it with things like Thoughtseize. But Sam the Stout-Hearted with Wasteland is trying to deny your opponent resources. So am I trying to go up on cards? Am I trying to play a deck that's in high resource game states, or am I trying to play a deck that takes the game into low resource game states? Well, and that will navigate you against different. Like if I sit down across from you, you're playing fucking ACAST. All you want is to play in a high resource scenario. Yeah. The only thing you're interested is playing in high resources, and that will change if your deck is also playing in high resources. That's going to change how you navigate than if you're playing in low resources. I feel like I'm just monologuing.
I think Phil, in these mid-range builds, one of the biggest things you can do is ask yourself these questions. Ask, like, not just what am I trying to do? Obviously, that that's the whole topic of conversations. What am I trying to do? But asking yourself, how do I answer the questions that are being put on me? Because generally, if you're a mid-range deck, you're levying yourself towards that control end. If you're a pile type of deck, you're trying to have all the answers, right? And so if you're trying to have all the answers, the question really comes down to what are the best cards to fill those slots?
Well, that also, like, let's say you're saying if you're playing a mid-range pile and you're like, okay, I'm going to be bigger than Delver because I am going to establish some amount of board presence in the early game, a threat that's going to close the game, but it is not an infinite resource like the way that, just an Uro Forever would go. Like Uro Caracas is sort of a forever deal, right? Like I never die when I do that. Maybe I'm decked. As opposed to like anything in this mid-range space that we're talking about. Like eventually you run out of Sorens Ransom if you're trying to Sorens Ransom plus Snapcaster, right? Like let's say you were to go all the way through it, you're not an infinite deck, right? You don't go infinite. You got to close somehow.
Yeah, eventually the game has to end. Yeah.
You're not force of will playing Thwart with Mystic Sanctuary, theoretically making it so that you can never deck, and that's your win condition, and you just want to not die. Your win condition is not dying. That's different. And like how you navigate the game of like I'm always the control role versus when am I the beatdown? That also changes your other choices. Let's say you are playing Grixis Delver, right? And you've got Bowmasters in your list now, and you want to play tools to optimize Bowmaster. That might move you away from the inherent Delver logline, which is establish a cheap threat plus mana denial and cheap counter magic to keep you off balance and close the game before you can use all of your resources, right? Like Delver's game plan ideally is you win the game and they still have 5 cards in hand, right? They didn't have time to deploy all of their resources. That's what Delver's done forever.
A tempo deck, right?
What Delver's done forever. And then if we start moving into a space where we're like, well, these cards would work with Bowmasters. I want to play cards that, I want to play, we both draw cards and I get to ping you with Orcish Bowmasters, but now it just gets sloppy. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I feel like I'm not articulating it all that well, but your log line helps you from getting sloppy, from your deck choices, your card choices from becoming sloppy and steering you away from what your deck is trying to do. What is the macro thing your deck wants to do? And how are you executing that with your card choices every game? Now, you can adjust for metagames. You can adjust for certain specific opposing archetypes, right? Like maybe you're slanted and you're playing a Fork Bolt because you want to be able to beat up decks that play a bunch of cheap creatures, whatever. But as a whole, when you sit down, you know what your deck does. So it's kind of like, I'm playing Delver. If you play a 3-drop, it's kind of like, well, if I'm playing a 3-drop, it's assuming that we're going to get to a stage where 3-drops matter significantly, and I want the game to be over or in a position where they can never actually stabilize with a 3-drop and play before it ends. And so why am I playing a 3-drop that doesn't help me close the game faster? Where, like, if you play a 3-drop and it's like, Sulfuric Vortex, it's like, all right, yeah, that's trying to close
that
the door.
Begins to end the game.
You know,
yes.
you know what I mean? It's like if we get to that stage in the game, it should be close enough that Sulfuric Vortex ends the game, as opposed to like when I've been seeing Delver decks like play Narset, 3-mana Narset, and I can't fathom why it's there. Like maybe it's a hate piece to like against opposing the One Rings or whatever, but it does nothing with what the deck wants to do. Like the game plan.
I don't look to draw non-creature spells like off of my 3-drop when I'm playing Delver. I'm looking to figure out what my threat is that I want to end the game with. Hopefully, by the time I've gotten to 3 mana as a Delver deck, I have you are on such a back foot that all I'm looking to do is find my final threat. You know. And I don't think Narset does that in any meaningful way.
So I think this is where that idea, right? Like that's a good way to put the Delver logline, right? Like the goal is to keep the opponent on the back foot the entirety of the game until they die, right?
Yes.
They never feel like they have proper footing in the game.
Like your ideal end game is winning with no cards in your hand, and your opponent is sitting there with like 1 tapped land and 5 or 6 cards in their hand. Like that's your ideal scenario is like they have exhausted every option they could, and you've exhausted every option you could, and you got there.
And I think that is a way that, like, had we been discussing this when Expressive Iteration was banned and we were talking about other sources of card advantage.
Yeah.
The one thing that is different about what Expressive did versus something that like Predict does, or any of the other card advantage spells that people are trying to tell, is the card advantage spells do just that. They give you some amount of card advantage, but in exchange for that card advantage, you're offering your opponent time, right? Because you're spending time to cast those spells to go up cards, and that gives your opponent time, which is the resource that you are trying to leverage, being better at using anyway. Yeah. The one thing
that's actually why I was kind of shocked to see that the first deck to do well with Sorens Ransom was a tempo deck, was Death Shadow.
Well, the part of what Sorens Ransom does for Death Shadow is there's the clause of giving a creature skulk, right?
Yeah.
So that can be relevant at
just
closing
non-zero
the door
for sure
against, like, if you have a big Death Shadow, right, and your opponent's at 6, and they play a large Murktide to contend with your Death Shadow, and then you can give it Skulk, even though it's a fat creature, it can still then go under. Like, if you have if you are like, okay, my opponent is going to play an Uro, that's a 6/6. I have a Death Shadow that I can make it a 5/5, tempt it, get in for 5, and then maybe that's what you need to close the door.
Right? Or tempt it, attack for 5, and then, like, shock fetch yourself and hit for 8.
But the other value of it is Sorens Ransom dumping to the graveyard is a way to turbo a Murktide, in a way that Grixis Delver has Dragon Rage Channeler to like turbo stuff to the yard. You can play a Sorens Ransom. If
and
they
that works in Death Shadow as well. Yeah.
At worst, they're going to give you 2 and 2, right?
Yep.
Maybe they give you 1 and 3 if there's a really critical card. If you're like, well, I just need to load up the graveyard, Sorens Ransom plus 3 cards in the yard, or 2 cards in the yard.
That's free. You just cast Sorens Ransom for free in that scenario because you netted 3 mana.
It's a way to turbo. It's doing functionally similar things to what Dragon Rage Channeler is doing in Grixis Delver. With regards to Murktide. But one thing that Expressive Iteration did that the other card advantage spells that tried to replace it didn't do is it didn't let up the pressure. So if I played an Expressive Iteration, which found me a land plus a threat, I maintained that I played another threat. It kept you on the back foot. You still had to answer. I still controlled the narrative. If I played a cantrip plus a predict and the board is clear, then you can play something, and now you have the narrative because now I have to act. Right, and
I think just by the nature of that card, making you have to play aggressive spells. You can't like put a Daze into exile. Like, that's not where you want to be, or a Force of Will to exile. That's not where you want to be. You have to choose aggressive spells. So you generally shuffle those cards to the bottom of the deck, and you're playing your Lightning Bolt. You're grabbing your land, or you're getting your Dragon Rage Channeler. You're on a more aggressive stance.
I think it's why, in my view, back then, Expressive Iteration felt like it was more powerful in Delver than it was in 4-color, not just because Delver was cheaper and therefore you could deploy more things off of a turn 2 or turn 3 expressive in ways that you couldn't necessarily control, but because the selection made it so that you could maintain pressure. You are like, I can always find the thing to maintain the narrative of the game, where a raw card thing that's just giving you raw pieces, like raw blank pieces of cardboard, you don't necessarily know what they are, something like a Predict or something like an Archmage's Charm or whatever, where you're like, this is going to replace itself with more cards. But what those cards are, you don't necessarily know. The selection of expressive iteration, allowing you to maintain control of the narrative, a la doing what your deck is trying to continue doing, is way more valuable like in play than it seems like on the surface, where we were just like, what are card advantage spells that you can replace it with? It wasn't just card advantage spells. It wasn't just a card advantage spell. It was a card that let you maintain the narrative or the log line of what your deck is trying to do whenever you cast it. So it still fit what the deck wanted to be, right? Where people play Predict in a DRC shell and they go, well, yeah, this is great when I'm trying to go up volume, but then it's giving my opponent time to actually establish themselves. I think that's important when you're thinking about how do the cards play in what my deck wants to do. I'm trying to find a better way to articulate it, but as I've been brewing with the Lord of the Rings cards, the more and more I find that as I'm trying out different pieces with different cards, I've been trying Sam the Stout-Hearted with Wasteland. Card is very good. Sam the Stout-Hearted is just a very good card. At its baseline, on turn 2, you can pick up a fetch at instant speed on in your opponent's end step. Or on your turn 3, you can Wasteland, pick up the Wasteland, and then they have to fear a Wasteland for the next turn. But what that means is, oh, should I be playing Sam the Stout-Hearted also in a Daze deck? Because I'm trying to be a mana denial deck. Well, what does that look like then? Should I also be, am I just trying to be a slightly bigger version of Delver by playing the strategy that's trying to play in mana denial? Or should I be playing Sam the Stout-Hearted with Caracas in sort of like a Mox Diamond-y Life from the Loam-ish looking deck where I'm still playing in this space of like, I'm trying to sacrifice stuff? Or should I be playing it in a harder lands build that leans on Urza Saga, because Urza Saga sacks itself, and then I can use Sam the Stout-Hearted to pick it up, and then also pick up Wasteland or pick up Fetchland. So now my Sam the Stout-Hearted is sort of doing a similar function of what Life from the Loam does, where it's a spell that helps me, and now I have 8 Life from the Loam effects, if you will, in my lands deck, where I'm trying to deny my opponent resources and then incidentally grind them out with having these uncounterable pieces in my... It can go a billion different ways, right? Yeah. We can brew a billion different ways, but like that, the difference of I'm playing Sam the Stout-Hearted to function like a Life from the Loam is very different than I'm trying to play a Sam the Stout-Hearted because I want to, make my Baleful Strix a Ring Bearer so I can pick it up and then continue to draw cards. Those are very different plans. The card does, like when you cast Sam the Stout-Hearted, it's going to do the same thing, but how you're playing with that effect is very different. And what your log line is, what am I trying to do? I want to grind into the late game with a bunch of cards that replace themselves so that my opponent trading 1-for-1 is an extremely favorable trade for me. So I'm going to play a bunch of 2-for-1s, and I'm going to play cards that then leverage those 2-for-1s. So I want to play Snapcaster, which is a 2-for-1, and Sorens Ransom, which is at least a 2-for-1, and then I'm going to ring temp my Snapcaster and pick it up with Caracas, which is going to give me another 2-for-1. I'm going to Snapcaster 2-for-1, I'm going to 4-for-1, and then I'm going to have all these X-for-1s, and then you're going to have no cards. I'm going to have 7 cards, and then you're going to concede.
Yeah.
That's different than...
I think
I want to play Ghost Quarter and Wasteland, and I want to make it so that you can never actually have mana to actually cast your spell. You may cast a 2-drop, but that's whatever. I'll deal with it. You're never casting a 3-drop or higher. I'm going to deny your resources, and you're going to be out of the game. Those are so much different, and the tool is the same.
Well, I think when you're coming up with that as your log line, also you have to ask the first question you really should be asking is that the meta that you want to be fighting? Are we in a meta right now where going 2-for-1 against your opponent is a valuable way to win games? Are we able to, in that scenario, Delver is the most popular deck, right? You want to be going, okay, I can outcard a Delver deck and survive it, right? And if that's the case, then this sort of deck is where you want to be, I think.
Well, that's what I mean by when you say this sort of deck. That's what I'm talking. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right. Like, is it if you are also playing a mana denial strategy against another mana denial strategy, but you're the bigger deck, you aren't trying to mana deny anymore.
No.
Because they will do it better than you,
and
then you will die. But if your game plan going in was, well, my plan was to mana deny them, you know, what does my deck do? My deck denies their mana. Well, if they don't need mana to operate, then are you just a dog now? Like what does your deck do? And this is where I want to go into part B of the conversation.
Okay.
Eternal Dirtles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy, and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
What does my deck do? And in the event that fails, what does my deck do?
What's my backup plan, as it were?
This is a way that another way, if you wanted to link to the ABC deck building idea. Your plan A is, I want to mana deny them. What does your deck do? My deck plays Sam the Stout-Hearted with Wasteland to deny them mana by picking up my Wasteland and their behavior having to change, knowing that they may not be able to execute their early game plan because they need to play around Wasteland to get to their mid and late game plan. Okay, well, if I'm playing against Delver and they can operate on one land, and me denying them one land, or maybe cutting them off a color isn't, you know, relevant enough because they can establish most of the threats of a volcanic island, and they're playing all the volcanic islands. What does my deck do after that? Okay, my deck is trying to demand and deny them. In the event that doesn't work, now what does my deck do? And if that is, my deck plays Snapcaster and Sorens Ransom to grind and play the control role, that's also fine. And now we're piecing together so do you see where I'm going here? It's less so about your Sam the Stout-Hearted Snapcaster Wasteland Sorens Ransom deck sucks or is misaligned than it is knowing what the logline of what the deck is trying to do, and then if it fails, what's it trying to do? So if I open Snapcaster Sorens Ransom in my opener, I'm like, this isn't really what my deck's trying to do in the dark. My deck is trying to Sam the Stout-Hearted Wasteland in the dark.
Yeah.
And if I open a hand that is Snapcaster Sorens Ransom and I don't want to go to 6 and I'm in the blind, then I'm going, okay, this is what my deck does. And if I draw a Wasteland, I'm not necessarily the Wasteland Sam the Stout-Hearted deck like I would have been had that been my opener, because I'm playing a deck that's trying to piece together things. But now what happens if you open a hand and it's Snapcaster Wasteland in the dark? What are you doing? Well, if you Wasteland them, you move yourself away from a Snapcaster, right? And that plan being good. But if you don't Wasteland, that Wasteland can cast the Snapcaster to get you the Snapcaster Sorens Ransom game plan.
Yeah.
In that regard, in my mind, that deck that's playing Sam the Stout-Hearted Wasteland, Snapcaster Mage, and Sorens Ransom, you are a Snapcaster Sorens Ransom deck first, because there will be more combinations of cards that get you to that game plan than there is to get you to the mana denial Sam the Stout-Hearted game plan. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So if I showed you that deck and you went, Phil, what does this deck do? I say, well, it wants to Snapcaster Sorens Ransom into the late game and grind my opponent out by X for wanting them into oblivion. And then if that doesn't work, I do have the option to mana deny my opponent through Sam the Stout-Hearted recouping Wastelands. Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like we sort of just retrofitted an ABC deck building episode.
yes,
but,
sort of, yeah.
But at baseline, figuring out what your deck wants to do, if you're like, how do I have the deck first, now how do I actually apply a theory to it to know how to navigate a game? It goes, if I have a Snapcaster Wasteland in my hand and I'm playing this deck, I'm not necessarily firing the Wasteland off immediately, because I know that my game plan in the dark every game is going to be, I'm Snapcaster Sorens Ransom. And until something shows me different, I'm not moving into the Sam. Now, if I wanted to play, when mana threats and dazes or whatever, and move into like closer to a mana denial shell, or I want to play, a land style package where I can play like, I want to play green-white with Sam the Stout-Hearted and Wastelands, and I'm going to crop rotation for the Caracas, but then I'm going to use it to cast my Sam the Stout-Hearted to pick up the land that I just sacked with the crop rotation, and I'm going to move into that sort of build where then I'll be able to recoup my Wastelands and actually deny you. You know what I mean? Am I making any points here? This makes sense. Yeah, of course. is to, it lets you, knowing what your deck does, what your deck actually does a majority of the time, is going to give you clarity when you're looking at opening hands. Let's say you mulligan to 6 and you're like, okay, well, I have Sam the Stout. My 4 cards are my cards that I can keep 2 lands, Sam, Sorens Ransom, a Wasteland, and a Sam the Stout-Hearted plus 2 lands. It's a pretty good 7. What am I throwing back in the dark?
Yeah.
What would you throw back in the dark?
I mean, I think you get rid of the ransom at that point.
If you want to get rid of the ransom, then you're like, okay, my plan is likely going to, then in that
full Sam
space. Well, then the Snapcaster's kind of naked, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Snapcaster's not really doing much there.
So do we get rid of the Snapcaster and say, yeah, at least I'm going to get value out of my Sams, and the Sorens Ransom is going to be a later plan?
I think that there is argument to in that position, if you have either half, thinking which half is this is where I say, what does your deck do first?
Yeah.
If you were to dump the Sorens Ransom, that Snapcaster is now top decking, right? You need to find another spell to pair with the Snapcaster. Sorens Ransom is a little bit more open. It's going to give you selection to keep the game going long. But if your plan is to go Wasteland, Sam the Stout-Hearted Wasteland, you may not really ever find time in the first 5 turns to cast your Sorens Ransom. So it also will just sit naked in your hand. If you throw back either of the lands, now everything is naked. If you throw back the Wasteland, you're top decking.
Yeah.
But like, this is where, in my mind, this is a fun thing. I want to know put in the comments. What would you throw back? 2 lands, Sam the Stout-Hearted. Let's say it's 2 whatever lands, cast your spells. You're gonna have perfect mana. Wasteland, Sam the Stout-Hearted, Snapcaster Mage, Sorens Ransom. So those are 7. You're on a multi 6. What do you toss back? If you're a Snapcaster Sorens Ransom deck, I think it's also reasonable to throw back the Sam the Stout-Hearted, because you want to establish that you're going to hit your land drops. And if you're playing a Sam, depending on the rest of your build, if you're playing a Sam, not a Sam, if you're playing a Snapcaster Sorens Ransom deck, assuming that you're playing tools that pair well with Snapcaster, then you want to at least get to the stage where if you cast a Sorens Ransom, you will be able to flip over cards that will help you play from behind to catch back up, and then the Snapcaster will then help you leverage to either get back to parity or put you ahead. That game plan, even though it's slow, at least I know what it's doing.
Yeah.
And it's not stranding any of the cards in my hand. I know I have use for all 3 of these lands. I have use for my Snapcaster and my Sorens Ransom. This will work. Whereas the other cards will potentially strand a card unless the game is going to go long, and you don't know that in the dark. Anyway, I feel like we've talked enough about this. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah.
What does your deck do?
What does your deck do?
What does it do?
Comment below about what your deck does, right? Like if you play a specific deck, what's your through line? What's your log line? If you have to write your deck down in 1 sentence to tell people what your deck does, that's a perfect thing to comment and have us guess what your deck is.
Here's the template that I would use for looking at when you're building a deck, or if you're, changing up a deck that you play a lot. This deck wants to blank, and if that doesn't work, it wants to blank. Okay. This deck blank. If that fails, blank.
Perfect.
Fill in your template.
All right. Well, I think that does it for us this week. We will catch you guys all next week. We have some special guest episodes coming up next week, so those are very exciting. And maybe another deck tech. Probably cephalid breakfast this week. Anyhow.
Also, I just want to let everybody know I am the ring bearer now.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.